The Legend of Zelda has always been considered one of the greatest franchises in gaming, with hugely influential titles such as A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. Now, the most recent release, Breath of the Wild, probably broke all the previous records of popularity for the series, reaching a wide public with more than 20 million units sold, while also being recognized as one of the best games ever made. With such high praise, it's expected that the game will become influential. But when that praise is followed by a high level of popularity like this, it's also common to see some exaggerations. Yeah, I'm talking about these moments when the simple fact of a game showing grass and a horizon in a trailer, it is immediately considered a Breath of the Wild's copy, because it basically became the new standard of a naturalistic open world adventure. Hey everyone, it's me Luiz Estrela from Nintendo Everything, and the funny thing about this whole situation is that Breath of the Wild actually borrows a lot from other games. We all know that Nintendo is very famous for their originality. They like to create, to be different and all of that. But in Breath of the Wild's case, it's pretty clear that the developers took inspiration from a big number of AAA open world games. Skyrim was one example that Hideo Aonuma himself quoted as an inspiration. But we can see elements from Assassin's Creed with the use of towers and the possibility to climb any surface. The paraglider definitely reminds me of Batman's cape in the Arkham series. The slow motion during combat is similar to what happened in hack and slashes like Bayonetta, and yeah, that's what I can think about right now. The point is, Breath of the Wild is an amalgamation of old and new ideas executed to perfection in a coherent package. The final experience is in fact something that feels very original, and that's probably why the game was so successful. But due to the fact that a lot of elements are taken from other series, it is a little hard to actually pinpoint how far the influence of this game goes. Well, to understand Breath of the Wild's influence, let's try to understand the game's overall essence. What exactly Breath of the Wild created, and in which areas it can be influential. First of all, those elements that Breath of the Wild took from other guys, I don't even know if the ideas actually came from these games. I was just pointing out the similarities, and even though some mechanics are similar, they work in different ways. For example, one of the problems with towers in Ubisoft's open worlds is how they reveal a gigantic number of points on the map that the player simply doesn't care about. While in Breath of the Wild they reveal only the topographic formation, leaving the rest for the player. And that's kind of a trend here. All those typical video gamey elements that you are used to, Breath of the Wild doesn't have. The level of freedom is really unexpected. You can literally face the final boss by the end of the initial tutorial. Not that you should do that, but you can. Rarely a cutscene or a story event will interrupt your gameplay. A big part of what makes it feel so different is how it subverts your expectations about the way those kinds of games usually play. Let's take a look at its structure. It's a truly non-linear adventure where the player can freely decide which parts of the story to execute first. In fact, the main cutscenes are memories that Link can remember when visiting a specific places. A very clever way to tie storytelling and exploration. I mean, seriously, that is insanely genius. Sadly, this also creates a problem for pacing when you look exclusively at the aspect of a narrative. There are hardly any surprises or plot twists when you are playing because the most interesting things already happened. However, I still appreciate the audacity that Nintendo had to go through that route, and it definitely is a part of the essence of this game.
Are you sure?
Positive.
It's awake. Ganon.
And look, let's also not forget how many original ideas Breath of the Wild brings to the table. I don't think there's another open game with so much refinement on the in-game physics. There are so many ways to interact with everything in the scenario: water, trees, grass, stones. The player can manipulate those elements with Link's abilities and create an almost infinite number of possibilities for combat and traversal. To this day, we are surprised to see players discovering something new utilizing the physics of Hyrule. Finally, another element that defines Breath of the Wild is how it was made. How it is a gigantic study of level design on a huge scale. It's an open world where every mountain is carefully positioned to create a better experience. It feels very organic and random when you play it, but there's actually a design decision behind every bit of the map. It's not the kind of game that took years to produce because it has a crazy number of detail models like Red Dead Redemption or The Last of Us. Breath of the Wild took years to produce because the designers were constantly testing their ideas and trying to create the best experience possible. In my last video I said that sometimes Nintendo seems like a laboratory, and here we have more proof of that. So, in conclusion, the essence behind Breath of the Wild is to do things because they work, and not simply because they were always like that. All the ideas here, old or new, are executed to provide a fresh and smooth gameplay experience. Something like this will obviously be influential. Let's divide into two groups, the ones that wouldn't exist if Breath of the Wild never existed, and the ones that were just a little influenced by the concept. The first group has the usual suspects such as Genshin Impact and Immortal Phoenix Rising. Since the first trailers, those games were clearly trying to appeal to people who enjoy Breath of the Wild. A lot of mechanics are really similar, and there are even references to camera angles and other small details. But not all of those are the same, of course. Genshin Impact, for example, I think it's a very special case because even though it stole a lot from Zelda, it is a free-to-play experience with elements of gacha. I don't think the goal of a game like this is even remotely similar to Breath of the Wild. It's like they took Nintendo's concepts and applied it to a completely different model of gaming. Ubisoft's Immortal Phoenix Rising, on the other hand, is a single-player experience just like Zelda. You explore a vast world with similar mechanics, solving puzzles, and battling many enemies. The Greek setting does a lot to set the game apart, and there's a lot more dialogue here than in Breath of the Wild. The final product never reaches the heights of its inspiration, but it is an enjoyable adventure. Maybe the problem with a lot of those that try to be exactly like Breath of the Wild, and I include here some indie games like Yonder the Cloud Catcher, is that it is really hard to recreate what Nintendo did. Years of production and study went into the development, and that's not easy to recreate. If a studio is simply trying to provide the same experience, it will be really hard without a sizable budget and a lot of effort. The second group has a little more nuance. After the impact that Breath of the Wild had, it's no surprise that every developer creating an open world game will at least be aware of what Zelda did and take that into consideration during development. Some developers such as Sucker Punch quoted Breath of the Wild as one of the inspirations for their games. Ghost of Tsushima, Assassin's Creed Odyssey are more realistic and have a lot of focus on storytelling. But still, they took some notes from Nintendo in the level design department, guiding the player through topographical arrangements and trying to dial back the usual hand-holding. It's more of an inspiration in the general concepts and not actually copying specific gameplay mechanics. People exaggerate a bit, always trying to compare those games to Zelda. Because we live in a world that Breath of the Wild was made, these developers are able to imagine and create new possibilities, freeing themselves from some rules of open world game making. Another curious and recent example in that department would be Pokémon Legends Arceus. That one is not even as open as Breath of the Wild, you explore specific areas of the map one at a time, but you can clearly see that Game Freak was heavily inspired by Zelda. The naturalistic vibe with more sound effects and less music, how you can reach any mountain that you see, and the general flow of exploration. And surprisingly, the formula fitted perfectly with Pokémon, creating a game that is fun to simply go out exploring. It's hard to explain, but when you actually play it, you can clearly feel the inspiration. Well, apart from that, we have open world games that I don't think were inspired by Breath of the Wild in any way. Death Stranding, Red Dead Redemption 2 are two examples that come to mind. Not every open world game has to be Breath of the Wild, and thank God for that. We are still going to see the open world approach growing over the years in different directions, with new games always taking inspiration from others. It would be really sad if the gaming industry limits itself with crazy patents, and that's kind of nonsense that at the end of the day will just limit creativity. Breath of the Wild is a product of the games that came before it, and of course in the same roads a lot of new games will be inspired by Breath of the Wild. And that's it from me guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Until next time, bye!